If stories of quiet courage, unexpected grace, and the quiet yet powerful ripple of simple kindness resonate with you, consider pausing for just a moment and subscribing. There are many more stories like this one waiting patiently, ready to find you when you need them the most. Now, let's begin. Jake Merritt wasn't a frequent flyer. In truth, the very idea of flying unsettled him. The narrow cabin, the unpredictable turbulence, the surrender of control to forces beyond his grasp. But none of those things stirred his unease this morning, quite like the expression on his daughter's face. The look in Lucy's eyes when she had asked, her small voice full of hope, "Will you sit with me the whole time?" haunted him more than anything else. Lucy was only 7. Petite for her age, but keenly perceptive, sharp as a needle's point. She had inherited her mother's eyes, soft and searching, a gentle green always reaching for something unseen. Even now, all this time later, the echo of Claire's gaze still struck Jake right in the chest during the long, quiet stretches of night. Since losing Claire, Jake had worn every hat: caregiver, storyteller, handyman, emotional anchor. But raising a daughter while grieving felt like driving through dense fog. You could move forward, yes, but never quickly, and never with certainty. He looked down at the boarding passes in his calloused hands. One read First Class 2A, the other Economy 28C. That was the result of 6 months of scrimping and saving on a mechanic's modest income. He could only afford one premium seat, and he'd chosen to give it to Lucy. Her motion sickness on long journeys could be eased with more space, the pediatrician had advised, along with some ginger candies. Candies Jake now anxiously dug out from the side pocket of her small pink suitcase. Around them, the boarding gate was alive with the dull hum of travel. Agents making final boarding announcements, wheels of luggage squealing across tiled floors, and the low thrum of travellers numbing their anticipation with phones and half-finished coffee cups. Jake sat still, grounded in the moment, Lucy curled against him as he offered her a granola bar she likely wouldn't eat. Then a sound fractured the background noise, sharp and raw. The stifled sob of a woman trying to hold herself together. Jake's head turned. Across the gate she stood, clad in a wedding gown, but not the glittering and picture-perfect kind you'd find in magazines. This one was simple, a soft cream shade, creased from wear and dusted with what looked like gravel. Her veil hung crooked, like it had been yanked loose in haste. Her makeup was smudged, her eyes puffy and red, her lips trembling. Still, it wasn't her appearance that held Jake's attention. It was the way the gate agent avoided her gaze. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the agent said in a clipped tone, "but our policy requires—" "I can't afford another seat," the woman interrupted, voice breaking. "Please, I just want to go." Passengers nearby shifted, visibly uncomfortable. A woman muttered about drama queens. A man rolled his eyes and pushed his earbuds in deeper. The gate agent's voice lowered, but Jake still caught the sting of it. "We can't place you in economy. You'll need to upgrade or take a later flight." The woman's shoulders curled inward. She looked down, tugging at her dress as though willing it to cover her shame. Her fingers trembled as she tried to smooth the fabric. Jake felt his stomach twist. Lucy tugged on his sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered, "why is she crying?" Jake didn't answer. Instead, he rose slowly, his lower back stiff from years of physical labor, and walked toward the counter. He said nothing at first, just extended one of the boarding passes. "Give her 2A. The agent blinked, surprised. "Sir, are you sure?" "I'm sure," Jake replied gently, glancing at the woman. "No one should cry like that on a day meant to be joyful." The woman froze. "You don't have to," she began, her voice shaking. "I want to," Jake said simply. Then he turned to the agent. "Can my daughter sit with me in economy?" The agent checked her screen and gave a small nod. "We can make that work." Jake reached out for Lucy's hand as they turned away. The woman in the wedding dress watched him, uncertain whether to cry again or to smile. He didn't need her thanks. He offered a single, kind nod before returning to the seats with his daughter. "Who is she?" Lucy whispered. Jake shrugged. "Someone who needed that seat more than us." A few minutes later, boarding was announced. Jake watched as the woman stepped onto the plane, head bowed, ticket clutched like a lifeline. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, but he knew what it felt like to be misunderstood, to carry a weight invisible to others. He had been that man in the grocery store, coaxing Lucy through a meltdown while judgmental glances surrounded him. He had heard the quiet assumptions. Single dad must be tough, poor kid. He knew loneliness could live in silence, in the spaces where people didn't see. Jake and Lucy squeezed into seats 28C and 28D. He tucked a pillow behind her, handed her a colouring book, and tried to ignore the cramps already creeping up his legs. The flight would be long, but the moment had already proven worth it. Somewhere ahead, in a first-class seat she hadn't expected, a woman who had almost been turned away now sat in 2A. What Jake didn't know was that the woman, Grace Hollister, not only belonged to a world far beyond his own, but she also owned the very plane they were flying on. She sat frozen, staring at the seat number on her ticket. 2A. The characters blurred in her vision, tears still burning behind her eyes. In her lap, a beaded clutch trembled in her hands as she tried to steady her breath. The man who had given her his seat hadn't asked her name. That in itself was a mercy. The flight attendant greeted her with a polite smile, but made no comment about her dishevelled appearance. Grace appreciated the silence. It was the first act of kindness she'd received all morning. The seat itself was impossibly soft, the leather cool against her skin. A blanket sat neatly folded beside her, and before she could even speak, a glass of water was placed gently in her hand. For the first time in 24 hours, Grace allowed herself to exhale. She hadn't packed much, just a small overnight bag, a basic makeup kit, and her passport. The wedding had been scheduled to take place at a country club in Aspen. She had barely escaped in time. There hadn't been a plan. She had simply run. She could still hear her mother's voice, stern and tight at the top of the marble steps. "Grace, stop this nonsense. Do you know how many people are watching?" And she had whispered back, "I don't love him." Her mother's reply, "You don't have to love him. You just have to say I do." That was the last straw. Grace had turned, lifted her gown and fled, through the garden, across gravel paths, into a waiting cab. She tossed a $1,000 handbag on the seat and spoke just one word, Denver. And the driver never asked a single question. Now, cruising 36,000 feet above everything she had left behind, Grace tried to imagine what life might look like beyond this moment. No more carefully choreographed brunches masquerading as board meetings. No more existing as a pawn in the image of Hollister Global. No more fitting herself into expectations measured by waistlines and bank balances. Her ring, 4 carats, princess cut, still sat on the bathroom sink of the venue. She had left it behind with everything else. And yet her thoughts drifted back, not to the chaos, but to the quiet man who had given her his seat. There had been no pity in his eyes, no judgment, only calm, steady understanding, the kind of presence that anchors you when the storm is loud. And his daughter, the little girl with freckles and wide eyes, had clung to his arm with the pure trust of someone who knew she was safe. That image made Grace's chest ache. Pulling the blanket tighter around herself, she leaned her head against the window, replaying the moment he had said, "Nobody should cry like that on a day meant for joy." It had broken something open in her, not because it was romantic, but because it was true. Midway through the flight, unable to stop herself, Grace stood and made her way down the aisle. She stopped beside row 28. Jake and Lucy were quietly colouring, crayons scattered across the tray. Jake looked up, surprised. "I hope I'm not intruding," Grace said, clutching her blanket like armour. I wanted to say thank you properly." Lucy's eyes sparkled. "You were the bride?" Grace smiled. "Yes, kind of. Not really." Jake stood, offering space. "I'm Jake. This is Lucy." "Grace Hollister," she replied, shaking his hand. He didn't flinch, didn't react to the name. He didn't know who she was, and that, too, was a gift. "Would it be all right," she asked softly, "if I sat with you two? Just for a while?" Jake hesitated, just for a moment, then nodded. And just like that, Grace Hollister left behind 2A. She left the legroom, the comfort and the privacy, and settled into 28B, between a mechanic and his daughter. For the next hour, they spoke, slowly, then openly. Jake shared stories about Claire, his late wife, about Lucy's love of music, about long days fixing windmills and tractors across rural Colorado. He didn't complain. He didn't brag. He just was. Grace, in turn, said nothing about the company she owned, or the private jet she'd cancelled, or the wedding that had cost more than most people earned in a year, before she ever said, "I don't." and for the first time in a long time, both of them felt understood. Instead of discussing her wealth or name, she spoke softly of simple things, how she liked peanut butter on toast and couldn't stand wearing high heels. She shared a distant dream she once had, opening a small pottery shop in Maine. But most poignantly, she admitted something deeply personal, that she had forgotten how to breathe until that very morning, when Lucy, with nothing but 3 crayons, had taught her how to butterflies. It was the kind of moment that cracked something open in Grace, and for the first time in what felt like days, she laughed, really laughed. And then, as the captain's voice came over the intercom announcing their descent, Grace felt something bittersweet settle into her chest. It was almost poetic. She had spent her entire life flying in first class, surrounded by privilege and polish, yet in that moment she realized it was the first time she had ever felt she was exactly where she was meant to be. She returned to seat 2A just before landing, but something about it had shifted. It was still the same, plush leather, generous legroom, a perfectly folded blanket, but now it felt foreign, cold, quiet, like stepping back into a life that no longer fit. She sat down gently, almost reverently, as though not to disturb the woman who had sat there just 2 hours earlier. That woman had been running away. This woman, this version of herself, wasn't running anymore. She simply didn't know where she was going. The intercom crackled again, the captain's voice smooth and indifferent. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our initial descent into Boston. Please ensure your seatbacks and tray tables are in their upright positions." Grace adjusted her seat automatically, her hands going through the motions, but her eyes lingered on the curtain that separated first class from economy. She could still feel Lucy's tiny hand wrapped trustingly around hers, still hear the sincere and unembellished way Jake had asked, "You okay?" No pressure, no agenda, just a question from someone who cared. Jake Merritt. She hadn't planned on him. She hadn't planned on anything, really. She had only wanted to run until the noise in her head quieted. But what she learned was that kindness, real kindness, had a way of finding you exactly when you believed you didn't deserve it. Especially the quiet kind. The kind without expectations or favors owed. Just a man who gave up his own comfort for a stranger sobbing in a wedding dress. And now, she couldn't stop thinking about him. The plane touched down with a gentle jolt. Applause rippled through the cabin, an instinctive response. Grace remained seated, gazing out the window as the city unfurled beneath the clouds, a vast, unfamiliar horizon that somehow looked like a second chance. A flight attendant approached her. She was older, in her 50s, with a warm face and a calm confidence. "Miss Hollister," she said, her voice softened with discretion, "we've been advised by Mr. Lark Benton that your ground transportation is ready. The car will meet you directly on the tarmac." Grace blinked. "Mr. Benton?" "You're head of security," the attendant explained. "He was alerted once your name came through the passenger manifest mid-flight." The woman hesitated, then added with a small smile, "You gave us quite the scare. Everyone's been looking for you." Of course, Grace thought. You can run from a wedding, from expectations, from headlines, but not from the infrastructure built around your name. She rose slowly, smoothing out her dress with graceful dignity, and nodded. "Thank you." The woman asked, "Shall I inform the driver you're ready?" Grace paused for a long moment, then shook her head. "No, I'd like to disembark with the other passengers." The attendant looked surprised, but quickly nodded. "Of course, miss." As the cabin doors opened and passengers began to file out, Grace lingered, waiting until the rows ahead emptied. That's when she saw them, Jake and Lucy, hand in hand. Lucy still had smudges of crayon on her fingers. Jake carried both bags, his and hers, with the same quiet steadiness, not to impress, but because it needed to be done. Grace stepped into line behind them. When they reached the end of the jet bridge, she gently tapped Jake on the shoulder. He turned, surprised. "Hi," she said, her voice soft. Jake offered a smile. "Hey." "Hi!" "I don't really know where I'm going yet," she admitted, vulnerable for the first time. "So I booked a small room by the harbour, just for tonight." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "That's a good start. Slow is good." She hesitated, heart fluttering. "Would you and Lucy maybe like to join me for dinner? As a thank you, I mean." Jake looked at Lucy. The girl's face lit up. "Will there be bread rolls?" Grace let out a laugh that sounded like healing. There will be so many bread rolls." Jake grinned. "Then I guess we're in." The Harbourside Inn was modest, nestled between a quiet marina and a cobblestone alley that led to a lighthouse. It wasn't the Four Seasons. That's what Grace liked about it. There were no bellhops, no designer cocktails, no one asking for selfies or commenting on her appearance. Just the scent of salt air and a fire crackling in the hearth. They sat in a quiet corner of the inn's restaurant. Lucy ordered macaroni and cheese and hummed between bites. Jake had meatloaf. Grace ordered seafood chowder but barely touched it. She was too busy watching them, father and daughter. The way Jake cut Lucy's food without being asked. The way Lucy described her music lessons and her big audition. Their bond was effortless, beautiful, magnetic. Jake looked up. "What about you?" Grace blinked. "Me? You ran away from something, that much is clear. But what are you running to?" It was the first time anyone had asked her that. Not why she left, but where she wanted to go. "I don't know," she answered honestly, "but I want it to be something real. Something I create, not something handed to me with conditions." Jake nodded slowly, understanding more than he said. "I think you're already on your way." They finished their meal quietly, except for Lucy requesting a second dessert. Later that night, back in her room, Grace stood by the window and watched the harbour lights shimmer across the water. Her phone buzzed, 23 missed calls, dozens of texts. Her mother, her fiancé, lawyers. She powered it off. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out her boarding pass. Seat 2A, a seat she hadn't earned, only inherited. And now it reminded her of the moment she stopped living the life others wrote for her and started writing her own. The door creaked open, and the old radiator began to hum lowly, like the gentle, wheezy snore of an elderly man lost in sleep. Jake reached over and flicked on the light. Lucy darted toward the window, her small hands pressed against the cold glass, full of anticipation. She was hoping the snow that had been forecasted had begun its descent, but it hadn't. Not yet. Jake set their bags down with deliberate care and let out a long, weary breath, the kind of exhale that carried the full weight of a long day finally put behind. Yet tonight that tiredness was tinged with something else, something unfamiliar. It wasn't just exhaustion in his bones. It was a lightness, a quiet stirring of something he hadn't felt in a long while. Hope. Grace had walked them back to the rental earlier that morning, promising she'd stop by after tending to some business. Jake had assumed that would be the last they'd see of her. But to his surprise, she returned in less than 4 hours, arms full, with a small stack of books for Lucy and a warm thermos of hot cocoa she insisted was from the best cafe in all of Boston. No debate, she'd said with a smile. And then just before the sun dipped beneath the harbour line, she'd invited them both to dinner, this time at her temporary suite overlooking the water. Jake had hesitated. It felt like too much, too generous, too one-sided. But then he'd seen Lucy's eyes light up. And Grace, with a laugh that disarmed him, had said, "It's just soup and sandwiches. I'm not proposing marriage." Now, standing alone in the soft glow of their rental's kitchen, Jake listened as Lucy giggled to her stuffed fox, telling it stories about snowflakes and piano recitals. He opened her tin lunchbox to prepare a light bedtime snack. Though his hands moved on autopilot, his mind, however, was far away. It was fixed on Grace. There was something about her, something layered, something he couldn't quite place. Not suspicious, not threatening, just unusual. She was warm, easy to talk to, often poking fun at herself. But Jake had noticed the details, the small things. The graceful way she tipped a cab driver, the ease with which she ordered wine, the calm control she had in unfamiliar spaces. These weren't habits picked up casually. They were traits shaped by a life of exposure, of privilege. When they'd first met, she'd been in a dress meant for a crowd, a carefully curated image. Now, just 2 days later, she was in jeans, sneakers, her hair pulled up in a messy knot, laughing with Lucy like they'd been friends for years. And that laugh, it touched something in him, something deep and still healing. Later that night, when Lucy was curled beneath her fleece blanket, breathing softly in sleep, Jake sat quietly by the kitchen window, cradling a cup of coffee that had long since cooled. Outside, snow had finally begun to fall, soft, quiet, like the sky offering the earth a kind of peace. It blanketed everything gently, like forgiveness. His phone buzzed. A message lit the screen. "Still awake," from Grace. Jake smiled before he could stop himself. "Barely. You?" Almost immediately. Her response came almost immediately. "Walk?" He hesitated only briefly before replying, "Call or walk?" A beat passed. Then, "Walk." They met near the corner by the bakery. Grace had bundled herself in a grey peacoat, her cheeks rosy from the cold, breath visible in delicate clouds. Strands of hair escaped her coat's collar, dancing lightly in the harbour breeze. And Jake's first thought, strangely clear, was that she looked free. Not rich, not lost, just Grace. They walked quietly at first, boots crunching over the fresh snow, street lamps casting amber halos onto the sidewalk. Finally, she spoke. "Do you ever think about how one small decision could have changed everything?" Jake looked at her and nodded. "Every single day." She seemed unsurprised. "If I hadn't gotten cold feet, if the driver hadn't looked away for that second, if you hadn't given up your seat, you'd still be in Aspen," he finished for her. She turned to him, a quiet pain behind her words. "Married to a man who sees me as a business asset." Jake stopped walking. "That's what he called you?" Her jaw tightened. "He said I'd stabilize the brand. That was his proposal speech." Jake's hands curled into fists inside his coat pockets. "You deserve more." "I'm starting to believe that," she whispered. Then softly, "And you? You're more than the guy in economy who gives up his seat." Jake smiled gently. "I'm not complicated. I fix things. I take care of Lucy. I survive." "You also see people," she said, looking up at him. "You really listen. That's rare." They continued walking, passing shuttered cafes and darkened shops. When they reached a snow-covered bench by the harbour, Grace paused. She brushed the snow off the wood and sat. Jake joined her. "I used to be terrified of being alone," she confessed. "Afraid that if I stopped moving, I'd have to feel everything I'd buried for years." Jake stayed silent. He understood that fear too well. "But now," she said, voice low, trembling, "I'm more afraid of going back, of pretending, of losing this, whatever this is." Jake looked at her, really looked. Her eyes were clear but searching. Her shoulders, still bracing, weren't retreating. Her hands rested in her lap, slightly open, trembling, waiting. He reached out slowly. She didn't pull away. Back at the rental, snow still clung to Jake's hair as he stepped inside. Lucy stirred beneath her blanket. He gently tucked her in again, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. She blinked up, drowsy. "Did you go for a walk?" "Yeah," he whispered. "With the pretty lady?" Jake smiled. "Yeah, she makes good cookies." Lucy yawned. "Can she come to my audition?" Jake paused. "Would you like that?" "Only if she claps really loud." He kissed her forehead. "I think she would." Outside, snow continued to fall, but inside Jake Merritt, something was beginning to settle. Something unfamiliar. Something hopeful. Like the turbulence that had long shaken him had passed, and the plane finally was gliding into smooth air. 3 days later, Logan International Airport buzzed with its usual rhythm. Rolling suitcases, scattered announcements, conversations suspended in the blur between departures and arrivals. It was the kind of place where people became invisible. That was what Grace had counted on when she booked her return flight. Only this time, she didn't fly alone. She sat with Jake and Lucy in a quiet cafe near the windows. Lucy was happily finishing a blueberry muffin, her legs swinging under the table. Jake sipped his black coffee, staring thoughtfully at the slushy runway. Lucy's audition had been beautiful. She played with her heart, her fingers dancing across the keys like they'd always belonged there. When she finished, Grace had clapped the loudest. Lucy had glowed. Jake hadn't said much, but Grace had seen the look in his eyes, a mixture of pride, disbelief, and something deeper, something she wouldn't forget. Grace had extended her stay by a day. So had Jake. They hadn't talked about it. They didn't need to. Some choices are made quietly, without words. Now, sipping the last of her tea, Grace glanced at Jake. "You know, you never asked me what I do." Jake shrugged, eyes still on the tarmac. "Didn't seem important." She smiled softly. "It's not." But Jake looked over at her then. "Maybe it is." She tilted her head, playful. "Want to guess?" He squinted. "Children's book illustrator?" She laughed. "That's flattering." "Tax lawyer?" "Ouch," Jake grinned. "Okay, what then?" Grace folded her hands, calm. "I run a company, Hollister Global." Jake blinked. "That sounds familiar." "It should. My father founded it. Real estate, luxury resorts, private aviation. I've been CEO since he passed." Jake leaned back, surprised. "You're serious?" She nodded. So, you own a plane? She looked sideways at him. I own 8. Jake chuckled in disbelief. Definitely not where I thought this was headed. Grace smiled. Does it change anything? He considered. Only makes me wonder more why you gave up first class to sit with a guy who irons his shirts with a coffee mug. Her laugh was loud, unfiltered. Then Jake's face softened. It doesn't change who you are to me, just explains a few things. Grace met his gaze. That's all I ever wanted. As they boarded, Jake carried Lucy's bag while Grace handed their passes to the gate agent. The woman scanned them and looked up, her voice shifting. Miss Hollister, your flight crew has been notified. The pilot sends his regards. Jake raised an eyebrow. The pilot sends his regards? Grace smiled gently. I used to sit in the cockpit as a kid. My father thought I should know how everything worked. They settled into row 14, business class, but no curtain separating them from the rest of the plane. Grace had asked for that, no walls. A flight attendant approached. Miss Hollister, she said, then turned to Jake. And you must be Mr. Merritt. Miss Hollister noted your daughter's seat. Window view, peanut-free meal. Jake looked at Grace, astonished. How did you? She shrugged. You mentioned it once. I listen. Lucy leaned across Jake. She's like a spy. Jake smiled. She's something. The flight was peaceful. They played games. Grace taught Lucy how to fold an origami fox. Jake read from a crumpled Western novel. The kind of flight that passed not only quickly but warmly. Later, Grace stopped by the galley. The same flight attendant was pouring tea. Grace hesitated. Do they always look at me that way? She asked quietly. The woman smiled kindly. Sometimes. But not all of us are looking at your last name. Some of us are just glad you're here. Grace blinked, caught off guard. Most of the crew heard what you did. Giving up your seat. That meant something. Grace's voice wavered. It wasn't a big deal. It was, the woman said gently, because kindness stands out, especially when it comes from someone who didn't have to offer it. Grace stood still, throat tight, heart swelling. She nodded and returned to her seat. Jake looked up. Everything okay? She smiled through a knot in her throat. Yeah, just turbulence. He tilted his head. Didn't feel any. I did, she whispered, but it passed. He reached for her hand. This time she didn't hesitate. The wheels touched down in Denver with a soft thud, and for a brief moment, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, before the sound of seatbelts unclicking, overhead bins opening, and voices rising filled the space again. But inside them, something quiet had begun to settle, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like maybe they were exactly where they were supposed to be. Jake had never witnessed his daughter so free, so unguarded, so alive in the present. And in a strange, quiet way, he'd never seen himself this still before. Yet even amidst the calm, something kept tugging gently at the edge of his awareness, the subtle absence of mirrors in the cabin. It was late on the 4th evening when the question finally found its voice. Lucy had gone to bed, and a hushed tranquility wrapped around the porch, where 2 wooden rocking chairs creaked softly beneath a velvet sky pierced with silver stars. A lantern flickered between them beside a tin lunchbox that had become a permanent fixture, now filled with cloth napkins, old letters, and Grace's meticulously folded origami creatures. Jake took a sip of tea, exhaled slowly, and then broke the stillness. You know, there isn't a single mirror in this entire place, he said, almost as if he were commenting on the weather. Grace didn't startle. She simply nodded with calm deliberation. I took them down, she replied. Jake waited, sensing more behind the words. Grace inhaled deeply, gripping her mug like a barrier she had carried for years. I've spent most of my life being stared at, evaluated, she began quietly, judged for the way I looked, for my weight, my name, my everything. Every space I entered had a mirror reminding me that I didn't measure up, that I didn't belong in the picture the world seemed to want. Jake said nothing. He didn't have to. His silence held space for her pain. As a teenager, I learned how to smile while quietly hating myself. And as an adult, I learned how to stand beside people who were thinner, taller, shinier, and pretend it didn't eat away at me. Her voice faltered. Her eyes shimmered in the low light. But it wasn't just the world judging me, Jake. I was my harshest critic. Every mirror was a reminder of someone I'd failed to become. Jake's chest ached at her honesty. So you took them down, he murmured. I did, she said softly. And I started creating a space where I could feel like a person again, not a product. I needed to learn to see myself through the things I did, not through the angles of my reflection. She turned to him then, really looking at him. You see me, Jake, not for what I'm missing or how I appear, but for who I truly am, when I'm peeling carrots, making beds, or laughing like I haven't in years. I needed this place to believe that kind of acceptance was possible. Jake leaned forward, placing his tea aside with care. You want to know what I see when I look at you? Grace hesitated, then nodded, her breath catching. I see a woman who walked away from everything because she refused to be bought, he said gently. I see someone who listens more than she speaks, who creates room for others to feel safe. I see someone braver than anyone I've ever met. Her lip trembled, moved by the quiet reverence in his voice. Even without mirrors, Jake added, reaching for her hand. She didn't pull away, especially without them. The following morning, Lucy awoke early, still in her pajamas, and wandered into the kitchen. She climbed onto a stool and began helping Grace mix pancake batter, her tiny hands steady with purpose. Jake brewed coffee nearby, watching them with a heart full of something new. Grace handed Lucy a spatula shaped like a foxtail, her newest favorite, and together they flipped lopsided pancakes, laughing at their funny shapes. Jake stood in the doorway, sunlight curling around them like a quiet blessing. Something tightened in his chest, not grief this time, but peace, and it unsettled him, only because it felt like home. That afternoon, Lucy uncovered a box in an upstairs trunk, Grace's old sketchbooks, pages brimming with pencil-drawn dreams, faces, landscapes, fragments of her past, all captured in soft graphite strokes. On one page, Grace had sketched herself in profile, head lowered, shoulders hunched. Lucy studied it silently, then ran to the kitchen. Grace, she said, I want to draw you now. Grace looked up from her pot of simmering soup. Me? Yes, Lucy said firmly, but smiling, not like this one. This one looks lonely. Grace hesitated, then nodded. Okay, but only if I get to keep it. Lucy grinned. Deal. That night, Jake found the new drawing tucked inside the tin lunchbox. Grace, laughing in her flannel shirt, sat beside a small girl with braids. The crayon lines were imperfect, but something deeper glowed beneath them, something more honest than perfection. Beneath the sketch, in Lucy's neatest handwriting, were the words, "This is what happy looks like." Jake closed the lid slowly, his throat tight. Later that evening, as the fire crackled and marshmallows softened into mugs of cocoa, the three of them huddled under one blanket. Grace turned to Jake and whispered, I used to think I'd only ever be loved in spite of who I was. Jake laced his fingers through hers. I love you because of who you are. Her eyes widened, full of wonder. She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. Outside, stars spun silently across the night sky, and inside a cabin with no mirrors, two once fractured souls were beginning to truly see themselves through the eyes of love. The town hall piano stood slightly off-key in a corner, poorly lit and modest. But to Lucy, it might as well have been centre stage at Carnegie Hall. The Shelburne Community Centre wasn't grand. The folding chairs squeaked, the curtains sagged, but it radiated something rarer, belonging. Families brought casseroles, teens giggled in the corners, and grandparents tapped along with the music. It was a local fundraiser for the food pantry. That morning, when Grace had mentioned it over breakfast, Lucy's eyes had lit up. "Can I play something?" she had asked. Not to win, just to play. Grace had paused, unsure, but Jake, sipping his coffee, had simply said, "If it matters to you, then yes." Now there she was, hair braided neatly, wearing a white sweater with a sparkly fox patch, tiny hands folded patiently on her lap, waiting her turn. Backstage, Grace stood beside Jake, watching her with awe. "She's braver than I ever was," she whispered. Jake's smile was quiet. She learned it from somewhere. Grace turned to him. "From you." Jake didn't answer. His gaze stayed on Lucy, full of silent devotion. A man in a flannel vest called her name. Lucy Merritt, age 7. Polite applause followed. Lucy walked to the piano with a nervous but determined face. Jake tensed, instinctively fearing stage fright. But Lucy closed her eyes, took a breath, and played. The melody began softly, uncertain yet sincere. But as the music unfolded, it became clear. This wasn't from a book. It was her own creation, her story. The audience held its breath. Forks paused mid-air. Conversations faded. Even Grace stopped breathing. The piece told a journey, beginning with a quiet ache, then slowly rising into light and discovery. Then came the crescendo, a soaring hopeful theme laced with childlike wonder, imperfect but undeniably true. She ended on a single note, stillness, then applause, loud, full-throated, joyful applause. Even the mayor stood, clapping with unfeigned surprise. Jake stood frozen, overwhelmed. Grace turned to him, her eyes glistening. "Jake, did you know?" He shook his head. "I knew she had music in her, but that was something else." Lucy ran into their arms backstage, beaming. Grace knelt down. "Lucy, that was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Lucy whispered, "It's called The Woman in White. It's about a bride who runs away but finds something better." Jake blinked, startled. Grace covered her mouth, overwhelmed. Lucy added softly, "It's really about you." On the drive home, no one spoke. The silence wasn't empty, it was full. Snow drifted gently in the headlights like Grace in motion. Back at the cabin, Jake lit a fire while Grace warmed milk. Lucy curled up in her blanket fort, fox plushie in one hand, music notebook in the other. Jake sat beside Grace, their shoulders touching in the firelight. "You okay?" he asked softly. She nodded. "More than okay. She wrote that for me." "I know," Jake said. "That's what undid me." He reached for her hand. "I've been waiting for the right moment to say something, but I realized the moment's already happened. It was that night on the plane, that first morning, every day since." Grace looked at him, her heartbeat loud in her ears. "I love you," Jake said, without fanfare, just truth. Tears welled in Grace's eyes. "You love this me?" Jake leaned closer. "I only ever knew this you." Their kiss was not a cinematic climax. It was quiet, steady. Certain, like the final puzzle piece fitting perfectly into place. When they parted, she whispered, "I love you too." The next morning, Grace framed Lucy's sheet music and hung it above the piano. Below the title, The Woman in White, Lucy had written, "For Grace, who found her real song, and for my dad, who heard it first." Jake stood in the doorway, reading the words. His throat tightened, not from sorrow this time, but from a gratitude so profound it left him breathless. As spring gently thawed Vermont, the snow receded like a shy guest. Shoots of green pushed through the earth, quiet and determined. Jake found himself waking early, not from habit but hope. The light in the cabin didn't just fill the rooms, it healed them. The air now hummed with Grace's soft morning singing, the clink of mugs and the scribble of Lucy's pencils as she filled pages with stories and songs. There was laughter, music, and a sense of something long lost returning, belonging. One morning, Jake stood at the entryway with a hammer in one hand and a wooden frame in the other. Grace watched from the armchair, book resting in her lap. "You sure about that spot?" she teased. "Above the coat rack? High traffic zone." Jake smiled. "Exactly. I want everyone to see it." He lifted the frame. Inside was his original boarding pass, seat 2A, first class. The corner was creased. A faint smudge of lipstick, Grace's, though she hadn't known it then. Beneath it, he'd written in careful block letters, "The seat I gave away, the life I never expected." Grace blinked slowly. "You kept it." Jake turned to her. "You changed everything in that seat." She shook her head gently, full of emotion. "You made the first move. I just gave up a chair." Jake's voice dropped. "You gave up a whole world." He hung it with care. It now rested beneath Lucy's sketch of the woman in white, beside Jake's old work cap. The wall, in its quiet way, had become a gallery of redemption.